and balance effectively in place where we can bring all those customers back. I'm going to ask Dan Woodfin, our Senior Director of Grid Operations, to talk a little bit about the progress we have made in that regard and where we see it heading going forward. I think before I do that, one other thing. I know some of you were here for the background on the event, and you know, we saw this storm coming, both in our weather forecast and then the forecast available to the general public. Knew it was coming. The leadership in Texas knew it was coming, asked for a disaster declaration, which was granted last week. A lot of steps have been taken to prepare ourselves for what we're going to be seeing, prepare our market participants for what we saw. And we understood that there may be an imbalance of load and generation that would cause us to do rotating outages yesterday and today because of the size of the disparity between what we were seeing on the historic demand side, higher than we'd ever seen in winter in Texas by far, versus what we were seeing on the supply side. So we saw this coming, but the thing that really shifted matters was Sunday night when we had to call for these outages. And that was because while we were seeing the tremendous demand side growth caused by the storm and the cold associated with it, we saw a large drop in the amount of supply available. And if we had let that supply-demand balance stay too long out of balance, it could have had catastrophic impacts on the grid itself that could take a very, very long time to repair. This has been a very trying event for those Texans who have had to endure it, and we understand that. My power has been out at my home in Austin since Sunday, and I understand the challenges that it's posing to people all over the state. But the work we're doing is to get us back in a place where we can get all customers back up and operate a safe system that doesn't have a risk of that sort of catastrophic event. And that's why we took the actions we did Sunday, and we're working our way through to be sure we can get everybody back on a safe and secure electric grid. So now I'll ask Dan if he could kind of give us an update on some of the key data that I think you may have discussed yesterday about where things stand with our system and its restoration efforts. So I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Bill. So we have, as the morning occurred this morning, we tend to, the power consumption on the power grid tends to be higher in the morning hours and go down in the middle of the day, come back up in the evening during the winter. And what we saw this morning is we had to increase this amount of load that was out on the system during the early morning hours today. We've been able to bring some power back online, some areas back online as the day has progressed today, and as we've gotten a small amount of additional generation to be available. But we've also, at the same time, we've been adding supply to the grid from certain generators. We've also been losing other generators where they have become unavailable. And so we haven't been able to add as much back during the course of the day that as we'd like to have. And what we have added back, we're hoping to keep online, but if additional generation doesn't become available as the day goes on, we may actually have to take some of it back offline to maintain that power supply balance come this evening, as the load that is being served starts going back up. We have about, the magnitude-wise, we have about 15,000 megawatts of consumers that are out. That's somewhere between 2 and 3 million people that are currently out. So that's the demand side. On the supply side, we have roughly 45,000 megawatts of generation that's offline at the current time. And so that number hasn't progressed as much as we would like for it to, because like I said, we keep losing some as more is added. And it's from a variety of reasons. The generation is out. It's for a variety of reasons and a variety of sources of energy that's being tripped offline. So about 16,000 megawatts of that is wind turbines that are offline because of icing in West Texas primarily, but also some along the coast. And then we've got about a little under 30,000 megawatts of more thermal generation, like gas, coal, nuclear plants that are out. And so it's really, like I said, a variety of resources that are out. Yeah, and so I guess that's the report right now. Leslie?
Okay, thank you. And Dan, from my perspective, you're out of the frame of the camera a bit. Might want to scoot in a little bit in case anyone's recording this. And Bill, now you're out, so yeah, just to scrunch y'all together. Okay, so I think at this time, now that they've provided their updates, I'm going to go ahead and kick off this question and answer session. I've identified some outlets that I'll call on first, and once those are done, we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. I see that several people are submitting questions through the chat, so I will try to keep up with those. So at this time, I am going to see if anyone from Fox News is on the line, and as a reminder, in order to be heard, you must unmute yourself. But I also ask that if you are not asking a question, please stay muted. We had quite a bit of feedback on the last call. Okay, well, I will start reading off some of these questions. Can you address how the locations chosen to be disconnected are selected, and are they left up to local providers to decide?
Yes, the locations that are disconnected are left up to the local utility providers. Ercot's role is to tell those utilities when the supply demand is out of balance and we feel like there's a threat to the security of the grid, that we need, X amount of megawatts to be reduced on the demand side, so that, outages are caused by that. So that's what we ask for from them. And it's based on a set percentage that is allocated to the different utilities in Texas, primarily based on their size. And then once that is given to them, it is up to those utilities to decide how to implement outages. And for example, some utilities may have critical care customers that they want to identify and try to avoid outages. But that is up to those local utilities. We don't have a role in implementing it because they know their areas better. They know what's going to be better for their population. We just need them to commit to bring us back the number of megawatts we need to keep the grid in balance.
Okay, I'm going to move on to KAVU TV. Why are certain areas and cities experiencing an upwards of 20+ blackouts in the last 24 hours, while other areas have not experienced any blackouts?
Let's get to that.
Yeah, so basically, as Bill said, the transmission owners, the folks that own the wires that are used to transmit power out to loads, determine how much, where and what neighborhoods and those kind of things are used for these kind of outages. Once we tell them the kind of the quantity that needs to be reduced. And so there may be areas where, as Bill mentioned, there are critical care facilities, places like hospitals or emergency response facilities, those kind of things that are not to be, that need to retain their power, and they're called critical care. And so those may not be included in the plan, and other areas that don't have those facilities may be undergoing longer outages. And so it's really just up to the transmission companies to decide those things based on the amounts that we tell them.
Okay, I think there may be an issue with folks being able to unmute and ask those questions, so I will continue to follow the chat. I've also received a few texts, so if you do have a question, please submit it via the chat, and I will try to get to it. This is Eva Parks with KXAS. How did COVID impact winter weatherization efforts this year? I know you were in the middle of spot checks from November to February. How many were you able to conduct, and how many were you not able to do?
So we conduct these winterization spot checks for generators who the generators submit a plan to the PUC for their how they're planning to winterize their facility, and then we go out and do spot checks of whether they're following that plan or not, and help to disseminate the best practices for those kind of winterization of plans for their plant. Typically, we send someone out to walk through the plant with them, along with some of the NERC regional entity representatives. And we typically do that for about 100 of the 600 or so plants every year. I think this year, because of COVID, we did that as a tabletop exercise, but we still went through the same process with the management of those plants. I believe we did 94 of those this year. So we hit the same number of plants. We try to focus on the ones that have either had problems in the past or are new plants and may not have had that kind of aware of the best practices and those kind of things. But we were able to do that for a typical number of plants this year.
Okay, next question. How many different plants and generators have failed in this event?
Yeah, so I don't have the breakout of the number of plants in front of me. We know how many megawatts there were, but plants are of different sizes. So we have that information, obviously, but I don't have it on this sheet.
From KRTK, what concern is there about Wednesday's storm and it negating a lot of the work being done to improve distribution?
Well, I think I'd say at the outset, the temperatures, the extreme nature of what we saw Sunday, Monday, still today, we're not out of it yet, the extremely low temperatures, and then the snow that we saw, the freezing precipitation we saw, we're still expecting it to be quite cold in Texas, but I don't think we're showing on the forecast that it's as severe as what we saw earlier in the week. And as temperatures rise, that helps us because it helps with gas supply, it helps with de-icing wind turbine blades. The sun coming out helps. That helps us give us a lot more of our solar power on the system, which we saw quite a bit of yesterday as the sun finally came out after a few days. So the even I wouldn't say minor, but changes where you're still feeling cold can make a difference as far as the factors that we're looking at. But again, we need to see what that weather actually brings. But we're hopeful that we'll be able to see some improvement in a number of areas, even though we're still seeing quite a bit of cold weather.
Okay, looks like Bloomberg posted a chart on Twitter that shows that loads are not getting any better. Will this turn around as the weather improves?
Yes, we as Bill just mentioned, as things start to warm back up, and some of the issues that we've been having really across the board, because weather is really severe. This really kind of unprecedented severe weather is what's driving this issue on multiple fronts. But as weather improves and we start getting warmer temperatures, most of those things that are driving, well, in fact, all of those things that are driving the outages of generation, the issues on the natural gas system as a whole, and so forth, all should diminish as the temperatures increase.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and read off a few more, and then we're going to see if we have corrected the muting situation so that you all can ask questions. Let's see, what tangible plan does Ercot have in place to prevent this kind of supply-demand imbalance from happening again during an inclement weather event in the future?
Yeah, so we, after the, I guess in general, we have plans in place to cover kind of normal extreme weather conditions. This one's a little beyond our normal extreme weather. After some issues we had with cold weather back in 2011, where we had some plants that tripped offline during that situation back in February of 2011, we put in place these winterization process, the checking process. The generation in our area, and in fact nationally, created some best practices that they would implement. And all of those were kind of geared around that 2011 level of detail, the severity of that storm. And like I said earlier, this one's kind of beyond what we saw in 2011. So we will go in. One of the things we will definitely go in is work with the generation entities and anyone else that helps us with that, and try to beef up that plan to the point that it's able to handle this, what we now understand to be even possibility of more extreme weather than what we had experienced in the past. So that's one thing, and I'm sure we're going to be looking at these in kinds of things in much more detail, but really our focus at this point has been more on trying to keep the system together so that we can restore power to consumers as fast as possible. We're really working this event now, and then we'll go in and start working on the process improvements and lessons learned and making sure that it won't happen again.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, I'm going to pause just for a second and see if we can address this mute situation.
Good Lord.
Okay. All right.
Oh my gosh, just them.
Okay, we're going to stick to the process that has been working thus far, so I'm going to keep going. I've got a lot more questions and text coming through. So are all energy companies being asked to cut the same percentage from their grids?
So the amount that each transmission provider, when we ask for, say, 1,000 megawatts of load reduction on the system, the share that each transmission provider has to reduce in their area is dependent on their share of the overall system demand on the system. So if you have one utility that has 20% of the demand on the system that's hooked up to their wires, then if we're reducing 1,000 megawatts, they will have to reduce their demand by 20% of that 1,000 megawatts. And that can make sure that the reductions are equitably distributed amongst the different wires companies. And it also, from a technical standpoint, it winds up, since different wires companies are responsible for serving load in different areas of the state, it also makes sure that the reductions are spread across the whole state and everything can better be held in balance.
Okay, I am going to keep down this list. I know some of you have commented about the unmuting. We did attempt to unmute everyone, but there's just too much background noise for us to go that route. So unfortunately, we have to keep the line muted, and I will continue to address these questions as best I can. The next one is, can you explain the PUC order?
The PUC met in an emergency meeting yesterday. Because as we were managing this situation, observed, and I think some of our market participants observed, that the scarcity pricing mechanism, we call it, the prices that apply when we are in energy emergency alerts that are set to incentivize generators to provide maximum supply during those alerts. There were some distortions in how they were being calculated. They weren't being calculated incorrectly, but in an event like this, we were observing for the first time some impacts of the formula, I'd say, of how those prices were calculated. And I think we and others were not really happy with what we were seeing in the scarcity pricing, given the obvious scarcity and need to bring everything on that we had. So the commission met yesterday in an emergency meeting and made a change to that mechanism, enabled us to put a software change in last night to, while we're in this emergency condition, apply this pricing rule that we think is going to be even more effective in our ability to keep generation on at its maximum throughout the event.
How much of the total generation on forced outage was just gas?
I actually don't have that number either. I apologize. Certainly going into the event prior to this tripping of generation, we knew that there would be some finite amount, very well known amount of generators that were going to have gas restrictions on them. But the units that tripped offline starting Sunday night were a mix of resources, but I don't have that breakout in front of me.
Okay. Can you address the criticism that the loss of wind generation is primarily to blame for the outages in the state? Is that true or no?
Well, so I mean, the numbers that I did quote earlier, where we do have a breakout between wind and solar resources and thermal generation, being gas, coal, and nuclear, the breakout is roughly right now it's 16,000 megawatts of what we call renewable generation, wind and solar, and of the 28 or 29,000 megawatts of thermal generation. Now, those numbers, I should note, include both generators that went out since Sunday, and also some that were out in advance of that because of these gas curtailments and so forth. But really, I mean, if that may be a way of answering the question, is that there is, significantly more megawatts in that thermal unit category than in the renewable category, as far as what's out during this particular event at the current time.
And I just add to what Dan's saying. Overall, as Dan emphasized before, we're seeing the loss across the various generation types, and it really, those losses came at pretty much the same time as we saw this storm sweep through and have its impacts on lots of different kinds of generation. So I think it's the weather, the storm that brought the issues to lots of different kinds of resources, and obviously working with all of them to try to bring as many of those of all kinds back to get on the system.
Okay, let's see. Next one, when did Ercot realize that this storm would be worse than the projections, and what last-minute steps were taken to prepare for it?
Yeah, so actually from a planning perspective, on Monday, the 8th of February, our meteorologists were recognizing that this was going to be a really severe storm. And so we issued what's called an operating condition notice for extreme cold weather. We issued that out to market participants. We asked the generators to make sure that they had reviewed their fuel supplies and had fuel available, that they implemented their winterization procedures. So that started on Monday, the February 8th. And then we ratcheted up the different levels of warning ahead of time to an advisory, and we began canceling transmission outages to make sure the system was intact as possible to allow generation to be used without any kind of transmission congestion. We did that on February 10th. We updated that to a watch on the 11th. And then on Saturday the 13th, we issued a emergency conditions notice for the extreme cold weather. So we were preparing all along, and in fact, we were preparing for some loss of wind generation, some loss of gas generation due to gas restrictions that typically happens for a severe cold weather event, because the gas industry will use that necessarily use that for human needs first, and is how that was defined back before the Railroad Commission's order. And so we knew those kind of things were happening. The real thing that changed everything was the fact that the rest of this generation that tripped offline starting in the middle of the night on Sunday, really after we had hit the peak for this event in demand for this load so far for the event, all that generation tripping offline, that part was not expected because of these winterization things that the generation industry had put in place, where we were doing best practice and everything. We implemented those after 2011. In 2018, we had weather that was just as extreme in January of 2018 as we had experienced in February of 2011, when we lost a lot of generators. And so it appeared that the winterization that we were doing was working, because we didn't lose any generators, or very few, in January of 2018. But this weather event was a lot more extreme than either of those. And so that loss of generation during the morning of Monday after midnight, that was really the part that really made this a more extreme event than what we had planned for.
I would add too, I don't think there was any underestimation of the seriousness of the storm. I think Governor Abbott sought a disaster declaration ahead of time, noting that we were expecting unprecedented weather conditions all over the state. The State Operations Center, the Disaster Management and Emergency Center, was stood up so we could operate this weekend, knowing we were going to have the storm coming in this week. And then we also, with Governor Abbott suggesting it and helping us make it happen, as well as Senator Cornyn, received an order from the U.S. Department of Energy declaring an emergency, which allowed us to do some things to try to increase the ability of generation to perform during this time. So I think there were many steps taken, both from our normal processes, like Dan described, as well as the efforts the state made to prepare everyone for what we were going to see, so that we could try to get as much out of the electrical system as possible. And again, Sunday night we saw a major change in what was available to us to serve the demand, and I think that's where the issue began and what we've been challenged by the past couple of days.
The next question: what's the biggest reason for the drop in supply still, and how long are outages expected at this point?
Yeah, so it appears that a lot of the generation that's gone offline today, either tripped or had to come offline, has been primarily due to issues on the natural gas system. And so, and I mean system spun large, from getting the gas from the frozen wellheads through the pipes to the generators and to consumer demand for heating from natural gas. And so that really seems to be it seems to be a lot of the issues for the plants that we're seeing become unavailable during the day today.
Okay, next question is from Paul Weber with the AP. What is the realistic timetable for when service will be fully restored, and could it drag on as far as this weekend?
Well, we're saying we were able to restore some service yesterday. We've seen, a continued increase in the amount of service we can restore. The wild card, the biggest variable that makes it difficult to give you a certain answer, is that, as Dan has noted, we're relying on the ability to get that supply and demand in balance by getting more generation on the system to meet the demand that will increase when we end the outages. So we're continuing to work with generators 24 hours a day. All of these generators have every incentive to get back on the system and providing power. So we're working with them through issues around, as Dan said, gas supply, around their responses to problems they had the night of early Monday morning, to make sure that we can get as much of that on as we can, because the more generation we add, the faster we can get the demand side, the customers, back on. And what is challenging about this is, if we lose some generation in this process, we might have to, go back and pick up the outages again to a certain extent to keep the grid in balance, because we can't let ourselves tumble into a situation where by acting prematurely, I hate to say it because this has been such a long event, but by acting prematurely to completely close it off, that we end up in that blackout that could last, an indeterminate amount of time, maybe months. We don't even know how long, a true blackout would last in order to speed the resolution. So we're just working very carefully with all of the folks in the market, but particularly those generators, to get them back on. But I'd say, with the weather moderating even just a little bit, I think we'll still be able to see, as we have so far this day, additional restoration of service. We've restored how many megawatts today?
Roughly about 4,000 megawatts today.
Okay. So if we continue to see progress there, we can, get that number down to a much smaller number. I don't think that's complete today. One of the factors is it takes time. It would take a few hours to restore all that load, but we're going to continue to work on it. And the faster that we work with those generators to get those issues resolved, the faster we're done. But certainly, over the next couple of days, I think we see, really good signs of progress, even though we still have, much work to do.
Okay, next question from Anastasia Bolton from Tegna, Texas. Why aren't winterization requirements mandatory with fines for non-compliance?
So the NERC, the National North American Reliability Corporation, is the entity that sets standards for the electric power industry, reliability standards. And they have actually been talking about doing and are in the process of doing a standard for winterization. There have been events in other parts of the country that are similar to this. What would be in that standard is along the lines of these best practices that have that came out of really the things that were developed in the Ercot market, but that is in process right now.
Okay, next question from Mitch Schnerman with the Dallas Morning News. Please confirm that 45,000 megawatts are offline. Is that over half of your total winter capacity? And please review the leading reasons for losing so much generation. It seems there would be shortages even under normal temperatures.
So I guess a couple of things. In that number, we're counting the full installed capacity of wind and solar generation. But in fact, during typical peak conditions, wind and solar generation, especially wind generation, is only counted upon in some of our capacity calculations for serving about 30% of that installed capacity. It varies by region, but it's roughly in that range. And so from a capacity standpoint, we're not actually, I think it was 16,000 megawatts. We're actually not losing the 16,000 megawatts. We're losing roughly a third of that when we're calculating it from a capacity standpoint. Then the other 28 and 29% or so are the thermal generators, and we count those at megawatt per megawatt. I guess the leading causes we've had. I mean, the wind turbines were out because of icing on blades primarily. The gas generators, we had some gas generators going into the event that were out because of gas restrictions on the gas system that were known in advance or have historically been known in advance. And then as far as the trips go, there've been, we know some of those things at a very high level. There's some very high level reporting when a unit trips into us, but we haven't gotten the information completely on what those things are. But almost in every case, we expect that it's because of this severe cold weather. Things like instrumentation lines that freeze up that are intended to protect the unit. And so if they lose their protection, the unit trips offline, so it's not damaged for a much longer period. And then there's also, as I mentioned earlier, in recent few hours, we've started seeing more natural gas unavailability. and some of those kind of things.
And I think there will and there should be significant review of this event, from a regulatory perspective, from a industry perspective, and we'll, I think, as we have in past events, get much more detailed information about what the causes, root causes of these kind of challenges were. But at the moment, the cause of the inability of the generation to power the grid is less of our concern than it is of the generator. We just want them to get back on, and so we are encouraging them to do that. Obviously, they're putting the work in to do that. They can diagnose their problems and then get themselves back on the grid. So we don't have a whole lot of detailed information because the focus has been on getting customer service again. And getting customer service again is going to require more of that generation to get online, and whatever they need to do to make that happen, we have been trying to be supportive and help get that grid back in balance so customers can be, fully served again.
I guess, Leslie, one of the things that might be helpful, because we didn't really do this at the beginning, and there's probably a lot of folks on this call that aren't traditional followers of Ercot that know exactly what we do, but Ercot does not own generation. Ercot does not own transmission. We're an organization that was put together to make sure that all the different entities that are needed to work and maintain the reliability of the big power system with all those different working parts, that all of it works together appropriately, and watching over the system from a kind of a high-level viewpoint. And so that's one of the reasons that we don't have all of the information about things like unit trips and so forth, because that's not our role. We don't own that generation. We're just coordinating to make sure that all the pieces work as well together and meets the standards.
Thank you, Dan. That was a good point to give that background. Okay, the next question is from KGNS in Laredo. Ercot announced about 4 hours ago that it directed local utilities to restore 400,000 households. What areas does this include? And also, what are your concerns regarding the governor's announcement this afternoon?
I think when we're announcing that we've managed to get some restoration on the system, that is a restoration that's then being distributed out to all of those utilities who we've asked to reduce demand. So if there is load shed going on, in all those utilities, we distribute that restoration in a similar way, similar percentages, as Dan was talking about earlier. So that's how we manage that. On the governor's announcement earlier today, I mean, electricity is an essential service. It's critical to the economy, the lifeblood of Texas. It's completely appropriate that we look at an issue like this. We look at Ercot's actions. We look at all the other actions of anyone participating and be sure those have been done the most effective way. And we investigate how we can avoid this sort of extended period of people not having power with these outages in the future. So a close look at that by policymakers, from the governor to the legislature and elsewhere. We're not surprised by it. We'd be surprised if they didn't, given the importance that this issue has had in Texas. So we're happy to participate in that, and we'll cooperate and hopefully be very involved in it in whatever way we're asked to by any of the policy or leadership folks that we report to.
Okay, next question from KXLN. Why was Ercot not prepared for the magnitude of this demand and energy across Texas?
Yeah, so I mean, we've almost already answered that in that we were prepared for a significant event. We were gearing up for it. We went through this series of processes. We have lots of things in place. And in fact, one of the things we have in place for very extreme events is this process of reducing consumer demand in order to make sure that we've maintained the balance on the system between generation and load, so that we preserve the overall system. Because if you don't preserve the overall system intact, it's going to take much longer, as Bill mentioned earlier, to start restoring customers. And so by maintaining the system intact, that allows us to restore customers as quickly as possible, as quickly as generation is available balance with that demand.
Well, I think to kind of accentuate that point, what we are prepared to do every day, part of what we do every day, is ensure that there are tools available to prevent the catastrophic kind of blackout that groups like Ercot, grid operators, were created to prevent, where you may lose the power system, for an indefinite time period, and it's very hard to predict what kind of impacts it will have, and it could be extremely damaging, both to health and safety as well as to the grid itself. And we were prepared, in 1 a.m. on Monday, when we saw the indications that what was going on in the system was creating a risk of that kind of instability. We were prepared to take a measure to make sure we stabilized the grid. And, unfortunately, the measure that we had to take involved having customer demand reduced. And what's been, very difficult has been that we have not been able to get that system in balance of generation and demand in order to eliminate all those customer outages. That's what we're working on. That's the top priority. That's what we want to see done as quickly as possible, and what we have people working on, 24 hours a day here at the control center to make sure it happens.
Okay, this is sort of a series of questions from Asher Price with the Austin American Statesman, so I'll just read the whole thing, and then if you need me to repeat, I'm happy to do so. When do Ercot officials expect things to be back to normal? Who's to blame in Bill and Dan's opinion? What are the catastrophic infrastructure problems that Dan alluded to if blackouts hadn't occurred? Could Ercot order individual industrial customers to cut demand? And Bill, how would you grade Ercot's performance during this whole event? That was a lot in one go.
What was the first one again?
Break it out.
Let's do the first two. When do Ercot officials expect things to get back to normal, and who's to blame, in your opinion, for what's happening?
Asher's question is, I noted earlier, we're seeing progress on restoration of the system. We're able to release more megawatts to the local transmission companies to get more customers on. And I have to add the caveat, there could be setbacks if we see generation come off that we were counting on to serve those customers. But we certainly are seeing progress there, and we're hopeful that we see a lot more of that today. And we get in tomorrow and we see the weather change to some extent, we see more generation come on, and maybe we can complete this event. And we're very hopeful that will happen. It's just we're still working through the issues around getting the generation in place to be able to make sure that happens. So I know it's frustrating. We can't offer a time certain, but it's a process that we are engaged in to get that the grid back in balance, where we can eliminate this altogether. And that is what we're working on. Who's to blame? Well, what we saw this week is a historic, unprecedented weather event that took the demand side of the grid balance equation to skyrocket. We broke the prior winter record for Ercot by a lot, basically shattered the record. We saw more demand from this set of weather events that covered the entire state of Texas, not just portions of the state. We saw that bringing on more demand than we've ever seen in the winter, and almost as much as we see at the peak of our summer. So you had this extraordinary event that was increasing the demand side, and at the same time, for the reasons Dan has identified, Sunday night, when that storm was really blowing in, we started to see the generation impacts on all different types of generation. So we had an event where the two things you need to do to keep the grid in balance were going in the opposite direction. And that's where we needed to step in and make sure that we were not going to end up with Texas in a blackout, which could keep folks without power, not just some people without power, but everyone in our region without power for much, much longer than we believe this event is going to last, as long and as difficult as this event is right now. Leslie, what was the next
Dan,
one?
this one, Yeah, this one was for Dan. What are the catastrophic infrastructure problems that Dan alluded to if blackouts hadn't occurred? I think they may mean if the controlled outages were not in progress.
Yeah, so if controlled outages don't happen where you keep the grid in balance, the generators on the system are set up to make sure that they aren't damaged, because if there's some damage to them, major damage to a turbine or a rotor or something like that, that generator may be out of service for many months. And so they have protection systems in place. And those protection systems, one of the things that they protect against is that could cause that kind of damage is if the frequency on the grid goes too low or too high. And that frequency is a function of how well balanced the system is. If the system is in balance, then the frequency is 60 hertz and everything's great for the generator. Everything's great technically for the generator. But if we get too much load and too little generation, the frequency starts to slow down. And that's the kind of thing, if it slows down too far, that can result in damage to that equipment that can last for months. So that's why we emphasize so much that need to balance supply and demand. It's not just economics, there are real technical reasons that we have to do that. We don't want those generators damaged for a longer period of time. They have protection systems in place that will actually, if the frequency gets too low, will trip them offline. Now you're further out of balance and other generators may trip offline. And at that point, you kind of have a collapse where you're having to do the kind of thing that Bill was talking about, where we're having to start the grid back up from zero. Right now, we still have 75% of the generators on the grid, the system is operating. The grid is still hot. 75% of the generators are to meet the load is still operating, and so it's fairly easy to, once we get enough generation to start adding back to match once we start getting generation back, we can add it back to load back to match it. But if we lost the whole thing, that's where it would take, much, much longer than what we're expecting these outages for roughly 25% of the consumers to have to endure.
And then one of the terms that comes up with blackouts too is cascading, where it's not just, one turbine that is broken and one generator that can't operate. These outages, when they're out of control in a blackout situation, without these protection systems working, et cetera, can cascade through a system. So you really can have geographically broad damage that, for all the reasons Dan explained, is extraordinarily difficult to repair. And you don't have any sense of, until that kind of event has happened, how extensive that is. But that's a lot of what we are built to avoid.
And our operators are required to take very quick action, including implementing these kind of load sheds that we're having right now, to make sure those much more extended outages don't happen. They can happen very quickly, and so it's important for our operators to be able to make those decisions very quickly. And on the evening of Sunday, they did.
Did Asher have a couple more?
Can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me again?
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost audio for just a moment. Okay, final question from Asher. How, Bill, would you grade Ercot's performance during this event?
While we are in this event, the focus just has to be on getting through this event and getting customer service back. Now, I'll say that the decisions that our operators made, early in the morning Monday, 1 o'clock, 1:25 Monday morning, that they needed to reduce demand were for exactly the reasons Dan identified. Seeing frequency go down quickly, it needed to be responded to, or we could have seen the entire grid become unstable and have just the kind of outcomes that Dan has described for a catastrophic blackout. So those decisions, I'm sure we'll look at, every decision that's been made every minute before and since, in how we responded, how we've worked with the generators to bring the supply side back on. And there will be a lot of review and a lot of determination afterwards on all these things, and there ought to be. There certainly ought to be, because this has been an awful event for so many Texans. We don't want to see it happen again, but we still have to have a way, the way of protecting the overall grid that we executed on Monday morning. So I think we'll defer grades, and I think that let other people who are observing our work as it's finally reviewed take a look at that. I think from our perspective, we want to get better. We want to get better every day. We want to manage the grid effectively every day. And right now, managing the grid effectively every day means getting these customers back in service, and that's the focus.
Okay, I think we have lots and lots of questions, but we'll allow to go over a little bit. So we're going to have to wrap up in the next 15 minutes, but let me see what I can get through. The next set of questions, is this the largest blackout Ercot has overseen? Are generators facing penalties for not being online right now?
I can answer the first one. This is certainly the most load in terms of magnitude, the number of consumers impacted, the amount of megawatts that were reduced. It's the most that we've ever had. This is only the 4th time in the history of Ercot that we've actually had to shed load, any amount of load. And the most we had to shed was, I think, 4,000 megawatts back in 2011. So certainly this is the most severe, and it doesn't happen very often at all.
Yeah, and I'll just add, not to be too redundant from prior comments, but it's like somebody said to me earlier today, well, this sure feels like a blackout. But again, we have never had a blackout, the cascading, catastrophic kind of blackout in Texas, in the Ercot region, that we've seen in other parts of the U.S., certainly in other parts of the world. We've never had one of those kind of events. This event, these controlled outages, has been extremely difficult, of course. It's lasted longer than anybody wants it to last, but I just want to make the distinction, because what we're protecting against is worse. And what we're trying to do to resolve it is extremely difficult for people in Texas, and we're working as hard and as fast as we can to get them back where they were last week, with a functioning grid that operates effectively to serve the needs of Texans in every season.
Okay, from this same reporter, can you explain what is required versus voluntary as far as weatherization plans go for what generators submit to Ercot, and can they be fined or penalized for not submitting sufficient plans? Has that ever happened before?
Yeah, so at the current time, those weatherization plans are voluntary, but there are significant, I guess you'd call them financial penalties in the inability to generate during conditions like this. When we get into a situation where we've got scarcity on the grid, we don't have enough generation to match the load, the prices in the wholesale market are higher than they are in normal conditions. And so if you've got a generator that's not available during those times, you're not making a profit. You're actually losing money. And so there are significant penalties of that type, but there aren't like regulatory penalties at the current time. Although, as I mentioned earlier, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation is working on, or is considering, potential standards that would change that. But that hasn't been completed yet.
Yeah, the way the Ercot market is established, as Dan said, the incentives are aligned with reliability. If we are in scarcity conditions, the prices paid to those generators for their power go higher, and there's more potential for them to make money in those situations. So it's really aligned with staying on when we need them, with maintaining reliability. But I think what we saw early Monday morning is that running into an unprecedented weather system that damaged a lot of equipment and made it much more difficult to deliver that supply.
What are your plans for tonight to avoid losing more operating capacity?
So we have been working with the generators all day to try to maximize their availability. Anything we can do, but we don't have a lot of control over that. Primarily, it's a function of the generation that's out there trying to make their generators back to being available, making sure that they have gas, trying to fix those things that may have frozen up and caused them to trip offline, those kind of things. They've been working very hard to do that. We're trying to facilitate that where we can, but that's not really something we can do. And so our ability to continue to reduce the number of outages and or our need to increase the number of outages in terms of these controlled outages is really dependent on how successful the generators are in bringing their generation back online and keeping the generators that are currently online available as everybody turns their lights on tonight and those kind of things.
Okay, next question, Eleanor Dearman from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Texas lawmakers are holding hearings in the coming weeks related to the ongoing outages. What does Ercot need from the state to make sure long-lasting outages like the one seen the past 2 days don't happen again?
The state of Texas provides excellent support to grid reliability. The market structure, the ways in which infrastructure can be built in Texas provide a lot of incentives for having a diverse mix of resources on our grid that makes it easier to operate in lots of different kinds of conditions, adds to that infrastructure as Texas continues to grow so that we can keep up with that growth and conserve the highest loads we saw in any summer. So I think we operate under the supervision of the state, under the supervision of the Public Utility Commission. We're fully regulated by the Public Utility Commission. We collaborate with the commission, I think, effectively, and don't have an ask at this point. I think as we get past the emergency, when we are focused entirely on getting customers back in service and getting things back to normal on the grid, if we find things that were deficiencies of ours that the state could help correct, you could bring those things forward, whether they're protocols or Ercot protocol changes or other things that need to happen. But I think we feel like we have excellent support from the state of Texas, and this Texas interconnection I think is very valuable to a whole lot of people in the state. So I guess I don't have an ask. I think we need to explain things. We need to take the questions, take the issues up, and explain what's happened over these past few days. And I wouldn't say that we have a request at this point. We just need to answer and be accountable for what's going on.
Okay, Noah McKinney from KTAB and KRBC. There's been a lot of concern voiced on the outdated structure of Texas's separate power system. Has this storm been a wake-up call to Ercot?
I would certainly not characterize the Ercot power system as outdated. As I was just saying, we have had tremendous infrastructure improvements over the last, say, 10 years. In the transmission and distribution infrastructure, the generation infrastructure, we're attracting new kinds of technologies, and we have a market that provides the incentives for those new kinds of technologies to come into Texas. So I really would, quarrel with the idea that it's outdated. As far as the Texas grid, it has been very successful. As I noted earlier, the catastrophic blackouts we're trying to avoid, we have never had one of those on the Texas grid, knock wood. You have seen them in other parts of the country that are more interconnected. It's not necessarily a fault of those interconnections, but you can have, spreading problems that we can kind of contain if they try to come into Texas. So it's been a very successful market, and it's been a successful grid. And we need to, maintain that success. And when we have issues like this, take the decisions we need to preserve the grid, but, try and get customers back on as we are now as fast as we possibly can, and get us in a situation where this power grid, which most days is taken for granted and is, something we all rely on every single day, that we're back to that state where we're operating it in the background and folks are able to use it for, the economic development and personal and business needs where it's so important.
Okay, I think we have time for just a few more questions. I'll see what I can get through. Given so many energy resources have frozen over, do you think it's a good time to invest in protecting energy resources? And if so, what would that look like and what would it cost ratepayers?
I'd almost like to ask a follow-up question to clarify, but I'm not sure what energy resources are you. If let's assume they're talking about generators, and generally the investments that would be need to be made to further winterize generation, we've already developed best practices that came out of the 2011 event. We didn't develop them. The generation community and the NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, have put out guidelines for best practices on winterization. Those were lessons learned from the 2011 event. I expect that there will be lessons learned from this event once we get past the restoration and actually start looking into those kind of things. Those things would be implemented. As if they're different than what happened before. I mentioned the potential standard that NERC's been working on, and I guess the question of who would pay for them is, in Texas' deregulated wholesale electric market, generators are responsible for and investments in their plants, just like any other competitive facility. So if a new factory needs to develop something to meet new standards, they're responsible for the cost of that. There's no rate making that goes on. That's just the cost of doing business that then they have to make back in the wholesale market. And that's kind of how the deregulated wholesale market works here.
Okay, I'll take two more questions. This one is from Mandy with the Texas Tribune. Could you address how energy capacity is calculated by Ercot and what components make up capacity from a data perspective?
Yeah, so I guess we do we do a capacity, demand, and reserves report twice a year, looking out 10 years, and we also do what's called a seasonal assessment of resource adequacy that comes out every season. And really, what these are is an assessment of, on a typical extreme day in that season, what would we expect the demand to be? And we have a forecasting group that forecasts that demand, and then looks at what the supply would expect it to be on that extreme seasonal day, both a kind of a typical extreme day and a day. Maybe the best way to answer this is to look at for winter. So we did a seasonal assessment going into winter for kind of a typical very cold day when the demand's high on the system. Then we also look at a number of scenarios where the weather may be extreme, the number of outages may be more extreme, the amount of wind generation may be lower than what it would be in an expected condition. So we look at that, and for looking at the extreme case, we look back at 2011 because that's kind of been the most extreme case today. And what we did some quick evaluation going into this event, and we're actually well beyond in terms of load, in terms of the number of outages and so forth, where it would be expected to, where even that extreme seasonal assessment is. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, final question. What improvements did Ercot make following the 2011 winter storm that resulted in a similar situation? How is this storm different, and why was this similar situation not prevented?
So, I mean, we've talked about that some. The generating community put in place these lessons learned and best practices for winterizing units. We hired a meteorologist, and he forecast. That was one of the reasons that we were able to forecast starting on Monday of last week that this cold weather was coming. we weren't only dependent on kind of the public weather services and so forth, but we have our guy helps us to assess when extreme weather like that's coming. We put in place various procedures, and I won't go into all the details of those things, but we put in place quite a few extra procedures that we implemented going into this event that resulted in some of these warnings and preparations going out to market participants in advance. And so I guess there's quite a few things. And I think if we had kind of typical extreme weather like a 2011, those would have worked. The issue is this is kind of an unprecedented weather event. And so we're beyond what some of those preparations would have were prepared for.
Okay, well, we're about 10 minutes over our allotted time, and I know Dan needs to get back to the control room, and Bill has many things to be taking care of at this time. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's media call, and we will continue to keep you up to date via our Twitter channel, and we will send out media advisories when and if we host some additional media calls. So thank you all for attending, and this concludes today's media call. Thank you.